This project grew out of research that I did for the Reckoning radio and podcast series. And as part of that series, one of my key ideas is that I wanted to find descendants of people who were enslaved at Oxmoor, the plantation here in Jefferson County. And I found it was really difficult, really difficult to trace, first of all, to find the identities of any of these enslaved people. And in many cases, all I had to go on was a first name. And that's how most enslaved people, if they appear in the historical record at all, the best we can hope for is we get their first name. And it is not at all assured that they are using the name of the person who enslaved them as the name that they use in freedom, for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which is, they might want to choose a name of their own choosing. So I lucked out, and there was one man who shows up in the papers of the Bullitt family, which are housed at the Filson Historical Society, that is mentioned by first and last name. And his name is James Sanders. And he shows up in a memoir written by Henry Bullitt, one of the sons of William Bullitt. And he mentions that he was married to a woman named Eliza Julia. And actually their wedding is described in a letter that's in the papers there. So that gave me a name of a couple, James and Eliza Sanders. And so, and I knew where they were come emancipation. I knew they were in Henderson, Kentucky, because that's where they were taken, as were most of the enslaved people at Oxmoor by the end of the war. So I went looking in the 1870 census in Henderson, Kentucky for James and Eliza Sanders, and I found them. And that is how I eventually got to their descendants that are on this call. And however, I lost track of the family after the 1900 census. They just seemed to disappear. And in particular, I was trying to figure out what happened to James Sanders. And in the world of genealogy, this is referred to as a brick wall. When you can't go any further, there's just no more records that you can find. And brick walls happen a lot in African-American genealogy. They're the rule rather than the exception. However, the way most African-Americans encounter that brick wall is when they're going from the present day backwards in time. And the place where they usually hit a brick wall is the 1870 census. The 1870 census is the first year that African-Americans appear in the census as citizens with first and last names. But it turns out, at least in Kentucky, there is a powerful tool available to break through that brick wall: military records. And not just any military records, but one kind of military record in particular, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. So I'm going to share a screen with you here and start to tell you about this. This is the key tool that we're going to talk about. It's a set of ledger books that were kept by the Adjutant General's Office of the U.S. Army during the Civil War, toward the end of the Civil War, to specifically keep track of African-American troops who enlisted from Kentucky and Missouri and possibly other border states, but the only existing books like this that are available to us online are from Kentucky and Missouri. Now, to make matters more confusing, this book that you see before you was miscatalogued by the National Archives, and I don't know how far back in history they miscatalogued it, but it says in the catalog for the National Archives that this is a book of records for Missouri soldiers. So even if you knew such a book existed and you went looking for it in the records of the National Archives or Ancestry.com, you couldn't find it because it's labeled as a enlistment ledger of soldiers from Missouri. So what makes this such a powerful tool? Hold on, I'm trying to get to the next page and it is stuck. Sorry about that. Hold on. Something is going wrong here. Sorry, folks. Here we go. Sorry about that. So what makes this so powerful, and my colleague Patrick Lewis has coined this idea that it's a Rosetta Stone for African American genealogy. And what he meant by that is, with the information contained in this ledger, we can learn things about these soldiers that we can find in no other place, okay? So this is hard to read, so I'm going to just sort of explain to you what's here. You have the first name and last name of the soldier. You have the place where they're born. You have their age, so we can figure out what year they were born. You can figure out where they enlisted. And this is the really important piece of information. The name of owner if a slave. Name of owner if a slave, okay? So it is very, very, very rare in any kind of record keeping that is kept in this country to have the name of the enslaver and the name of the enslaved and a first and last name that they went by, okay? Now we're going to talk about the fact that this first and last name that they went by in the Army could very well be different than what they went by in freedom. But nonetheless, right here on this page is more information than the average enslaved person is connected to in the written literature. For some reason, I'm really having a hard time. Okay, now there are other ledger books that exist that the military kept that also have enslaver names. So this is an example of one that was kept for men who were drafted into the Army, not those who enlisted in the Army. The first book I show you were those who were enlisting. So this is another group of enslaved people that we have information about. And what they've done for this particular book is they improvised where it says former military service here, it says owner. And so once again, we have enslaver names here that go along with the names of the enslaved. Now, here is how I found this guy, James Sanders. I didn't find him. I went looking for him. I had this idea that maybe he was in the military. He was the right age to be in the military. So I went looking in the military records on Ancestry under the name of James Sanders or Jim Sanders, and I found zero, nothing. And then it occurred to me he was owned at the time by a man named Archibald Dixon, okay? So I thought maybe, just maybe, he would be in the records of the Army as Jim or James Dixon. And bingo, I found him in this book, Jim Dixon, and it says A. Dixon, owner. So that tells me it was definitely the right man, okay? So the next thing I did is went looking for his military records. And so I had the name of Jim Dixon. And interestingly, he added a middle initial of S for Sanders, which is the name he actually went by, okay, which may have been the name of a previous enslaver at one time, because it says here he was born in Tennessee, so we can assume he had a previous enslaver before he came to Kentucky, okay? Now this is the next most important piece of information that is contained in military records for African Americans, pension cards. If somebody survived the war, okay, they may very well have applied for military pension when they became available in 1890. And so I went looking in the pension cards, which are all digitized. 100% of these are available online. And I looked again. So now I looked for James Dixon, right? Because I know he's going by the name of Jim or James Dixon. And here it says, James Sanders, known as James S. Dixon. So imagine, if you will, I'll jump ahead and tell you that I checked it out with FamilySearch.org, which is one of the largest genealogical entities in the world. And they ran a query of their database of these pension cards and found 99,000 pension cards that have two names. And I went looking through these. I looked at about 50 of them randomly and found that of those 50, about 90% of them were African American. So that tells me that there's anywhere from 75 to 80,000 potentially soldiers who served in the US colored troops who went by a different name in the Army than they went by in freedom. And this is really, really important, because if you're an African American, for instance, who knew that your great-great-grandfather was a James Sanders, you wouldn't know to go looking for Jim Dixon in military records, or for that matter, in any kind of other records during the slavery era, unless you find this card. And this card is like your decoder ring that helps you understand the names that these enslaved ancestors went by. And it also shows us the name of his wife at the time, Elizabeth Dixon. It turned his first wife died in childbirth, apparently, or shortly after childbirth, and he remarried a woman named Elizabeth. And now the next most interesting piece of information here is we know that they were living in Kentucky at the time when he filed for his pension, but at the time that he apparently died, they were living in Indiana, IND. Okay, so armed with this information, I was able to order a pension file for James and his wife. Okay, because the soldier could get a pension for being an invalid if they had any kind of wounds left over from the war, and then when they passed away, their widow could get a pension. So this is an example of the kind of information you can find in a pension file. Okay, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but what it says is rheumatism of arms and shoulders and scurvy and disease of back. So when I got this pension file, I shared it with the descendants of James Sanders, and one of them, Russ Bolds, suffers from a rare form of cancer. And the way it manifested itself initially for him was pain in the arm and shoulders and back. And when he looked at this, he thought, wow, it looks like he had the same problem I have. So this is the kind of information that white people might have passed down through oral history or paperwork or letters or journals in their families, to know that there are certain conditions that are congenitally passed down from generation to generation. But very few Black families have this kind of information available to them. Also in this pension file is a marriage certificate for this couple, James Sanders and Lizzie Williams. And it tells us where they were married, and it tells us the names of their witnesses. So that's another important piece of information for us. And in this file was essentially a death certificate for Mr. Sanders. And it lists where he was living at the time when he died, which is the Marion branch of the National Home for Disabled Veterans. And so I went looking online, and I found that there is a cemetery, a military cemetery right next to this, essentially a retirement home for disabled vets, and gave that information to Russ Bolds and his sister Lisa, and Russ was able to find the gravestone. And what you need to know is that Russ has been a diligent genealogist for decades, since he was a kid. And he has been to this cemetery, he told me, going up and down the aisles in the cemetery, trying to find the grave of his ancestor, because he had been told by his grandfather that they had an ancestor who fought in the Civil War who had a grave in this cemetery. But he could never find him because he was looking for James Sanders. But there he is. The military sprung for the headstone, but under the name he served under, Corporal James S. Dixon, 118th USCT. So there are a bunch of different kinds of resources that are available to research Kentucky soldiers once you have this key information that's contained in these ledgers. So we have the ledgers themselves, and there's these enlistment ledgers, including one that has recently been found at the Kentucky Historical Society that has been scanned but not indexed, so we don't know what's in it exactly. Then there's these draft ledgers that I showed you. There's the military records that I showed you. There is a death register, which I'll show you in a moment, which is really important because once you start to look at large numbers of these soldiers, one of the first things you want to do is find out if they survived the war, because there's no point looking for a pension card if they died during the war. So that's an important resource. Then the pension cards and the pension files, which we talked about. And just a note about the pension files, they are not free, they're not digitized, they're not available online. You have to pay money to get it from the National Archives, and it's not cheap. So that is an impediment for a lot of African Americans who maybe have limited means to be able to spring for that. The censuses, the 1870 census, all the way up to next year, the 1950 census will be available online. Then there are slave schedules. A lot of people don't know about these, but starting in 1850, the US government wanted, probably for taxation purposes, I'm really not 100% sure what inspired them to do this, but they started to separately keep track of the number of enslaved people on a separate schedule on the census. And we're going to show you examples of what that looks like in a moment. Then, once you know the name of the enslaver, which once again, you would not normally know about African Americans. But in this case, for these soldiers, we do know this information. And so then there are paper records pertaining to the enslaver. There are wills, there are deeds, there are estate settlements, baptismal records. Okay, and a lot of that stuff is online, not so much the baptismal records, but the others are. Then you can go looking in newspapers, in both Black newspapers and mainstream white newspapers. You can look in church newsletters, other kinds of documents that are online. Why is this work important? So enslaved people were considered chattel property. So legally, they were akin to livestock, okay? And so white people did not keep track of enslaved people's names unless they had a good reason to doing so. And it almost always had to do with money, inheritance, lawsuits, bankruptcy. Even after the Civil War, many archives did not keep track of what little information survived. So I have been told anecdotally about archives around the country who had information about enslaved people, and they didn't bother indexing it in their catalogs because they didn't have last names. So they didn't know what to do with that. Similarly, there are churches through the 20th century and into the 21st who have published baptismal records, but they left out the Black families. And again, they said it's because they don't have last names and they can't index them. My thinking is part of reparations should be making amends to African American families for the loss of this information about their ancestors. And that if this information does exist, it should be made freely available to African Americans. And that's the big idea of this project. So what we want to do is we want to start now in this summer, and hold on, and through the next academic year, to research a group of 230 soldiers from Jefferson County that exist in these various ledgers with enslaver names. We've already reached out to area schools, and there are a group of people that we're going to be interviewing who are student interns. We've also reached out to adult genealogists involved with the African American Genealogical Group of Kentucky that are going to research each of these soldiers along the lines of what I did with David Adams, okay? We've been talking with FamilySearch.org, again, one of the largest genealogical groups in the world. They're going to give us access to all of their documents, all the censuses, all the military records, all the pension cards, and they will give us essentially sort of a backdoor access to their database so we can create family trees for all of these families and make them freely available at no cost to African American families so they can look through them and see if maybe any of their ancestors are there. We're going to publish all this research in a searchable database on our project website. We're also going to work with educators here in Jefferson County to create free curricula for K through 12 schools, public schools, Catholic schools, independent schools, using the lives of these enslaved men who fought in the Civil War as a jumping off point to research the African American experience in slavery and after slavery. We've come up with a budget for this pilot project of about $150,000. We're actively looking for donations for that. You probably saw that coming, but just thought I'd mention it. Now, our overall goal for this project, so this is over and above what we're going to do in the next year, is to research the approximately 15,000 soldiers that exist in these enslavement and draft ledgers for Kentucky, for whom we have enslaver names. That's out of a total of 23,700 soldiers from Kentucky who served in the Civil War. Because we know about a quarter of the people who served in the war died, and African Americans died at a higher proportion because of disease, we're guessing roughly 10,000 survived the war. It has been estimated that for each one of these men, they could have left 1,700 descendants. So if you do the math, that's 17 million people alive today that may descend from just this group of 10,000 soldiers. So ponder that for a second. How powerful an impact this project could have on a huge diaspora of African Americans who descend from these soldiers in Kentucky. Okay, so we want to publish all of this online. We're going to perpetually maintain it so that even 50 years from now, it will be accessible. We're also going to back it up to archive.org, which is massively funded from Silicon Valley money. We're also going to put all this information, all these family trees on Family Search and Ancestry. So the many African-American descendants out there who've already done genealogical research can easily find this and connect it to their family trees. We want to provide all of this data to scholars from various disciplines, historians, African-American studies, women's studies, sociology, economics, especially African-American scholars. There's a potential here for all sorts of kind of collaborations with writers and visual artists, playwrights. We've talked to some people maybe about the idea of trying to separately raise money for a memorial with all these 27,700 names of USCT soldiers. But at the moment, this is all just kind of a pipe dream, awaiting funding. We have grant applications that we're putting out in the coming months to local and national funders, but we are most definitely looking for support at any level. If you want to make a tax-deductible donation, you can do so at the link that's up on the screen. And thank you all for coming.